Are you a Bernie Sanders supporter, but not really sure how to donate to his campaign? Well, it's easy actually. All you have to do is open a web browser, type in www.berniesanders.com/donate, and it will take you to his website, where you can choose your contribution from $10, $35, and so forth, or enter in your own donation amount. Choose to make it monthly or just a one-time donation. Once you've chosen your contribution, click Continue. And then you will be prompted to enter in your information such as email, name, address, phone number, and employment. Once you've entered that in, hit Continue, and it will prompt you to continue with making your donation. And now you too can join the thousands of others and help make Bernie Sanders our next president. Thank you.
Let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years.
She was the worst Secretary of State in the history of the United States.
But you used to donate, you gave a lot of money to her over the years.
Because I was a businessman, I guess I still am, but I was a businessman, I was with everybody. Everybody loved me. When I called them, they always treated me well. And that's part of the game. And that's part of what's wrong with this country. because as a businessman, I could have gotten anything from anybody. And that is part of the problem. Lobbyists, donors, special interests.
Is that why you were donating money to the people you donated? Because you donated to Democrats. I think in 2006,
sure.
You gave $20,000 to the Democratic Congressional Campaign Fund. You gave
Democrats and Republicans. I get along with everybody.
To Republicans.
Oh, whatever. But I've given millions. I've given millions to everybody.
So do you give, though, based on principles, or do you give based on who's going to do things for you politically?
They all love me. Let's put it that way. They all love me. I'm I did very nicely in life. And frankly, you give, and it's part of the problem. And I talk about it all the time. Part of the problem.
So even though you're doing it, you're saying it's a problem?
Well, I'm saying this. They won't necessarily do what's right for the country. They'll do what's right for their special interest, their donor, their lobbyist, etc.
We're talking with Dr. Martin Gilens, professor of politics at Princeton University and co-author of this brilliant new study, Testing Theories of American Politics. So you looked at the preferences of the economic elites, the top 90th percentile and above income group, of special interest groups and of average citizens with regard to each one of these three groups with regard to over roughly 2,000 individual policy prescriptions, attempted legislation over the past 20 some odd, almost 30 years.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, to recap. And what did you find?
Well, we found that economic elites and interest groups have a substantial influence over government policymaking, but that ordinary citizens have essentially none. The image that I think many people still cling to of America as a place where average, middle-class individuals play some important role in determining what their government does just is not the case.
A lot of people in my own state of Vermont and around the country ask me, what really goes on in Washington? Why do certain pieces of legislation get passed, other pieces of legislation not get onto the floor? And unfortunately, this enormously important issue, which gets to the heart and soul of the problems with our democracy right now, doesn't get the kind of discussion that it deserves from the corporate media for obvious reasons. How did it come about that Congress deregulated Wall Street so they can basically do anything they want, sell worthless derivatives, do the subprime mortgage business with it, which they did, which brought us to where we are? How does it happen that over a year after the crisis, Congress has not yet acted in a forceful way to go forward with real financial reform? Might it have something, my friends, with the fact that over the last 10 years, the financial interests on Wall Street have spent over $5 billion, yes, $5 billion on campaign contributions and lobbying activities. $5 billion. Well, you ask, let's get off of Wall Street. What about prescription drugs? How is it that in the United States of America, we pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, in some cases 2 or 3 times the price for the same exact drugs sold in Canada or in Europe? Do you think maybe it has something to do with the fact that since 1998, the pharmaceutical industry has spent over $1.6 billion on lobbying, and that maybe it has some effect, some reason related to the fact that they have over 1,100 lobbyists right here in Washington? That's more than 2 for every member of Congress. The amount of money we spend on the military, despite the end of the Cold War, goes up and up and up. Do you think it has something to do with the fact that over the past decade, the defense industry has spent more than $447 million on lobbying and $144 million in campaign contributions? ExxonMobil, year after year, record-breaking profits, working people pay very high prices at the gas pump. Bottom line here is you got a horrendous situation in which big money controls to a very significant degree the agenda. If you don't have the money, you get to the end of the line.
As a result of the disastrous Supreme Court decision in the Citizens United case, the American political system has been totally corrupted, and the foundations of American democracy are being undermined. When one family spends more money than either of the two major political parties, that is not democracy, that is oligarchy. And that is why we have got to overturn Citizens United. And why we need public funding of elections. I see a lot of young people here today. And I want our young people to be able to run for office if they want to and not have to beg money from the rich and the powerful to do that.
No president, no progressive president can succeed unless there are millions and millions and millions of people actively involved in the struggle every single day. If anybody in this room thinks, well, gee, I hope Bernie runs for president, I'll vote for him, I'll support him, I'll send him $25, and I'll wish him the best of luck. It doesn't work that way.
The answer, of course, is public funding of elections. We've begun to see some good things at the statewide level. But if you're concerned about public policy in general in this country, healthcare, the environment, whatever it may be, we've got to pay attention about the power of big money in terms of their campaign contributions and their lobbying activities.
First and foremost, to my mind, is the state of American democracy. We are a democracy. And men and women have fought and died to preserve American democracy, which means that the people of America, not kings, not queens, not an aristocracy, but the people of this country, regardless of where they come from or their economic status, has the right to participate in the political process, elect their leaders, and create the future that they want for themselves and their kids. And what is the status of American democracy today? Well, we just came from a midterm election. Republicans did very, very well. But I think what's important to understand is that in that election, that national election, 63% of the American people didn't vote. 80% of young people didn't vote. Overwhelming majority of low-income and working people didn't vote. Now, there are a million reasons why an individual doesn't vote. But my guess is that for many people, they look at the political process and they say, yeah, my family is hurting. I'm working longer hours for lower wages. My job went to China. My kid can't afford to go to college. I can't afford health insurance. What are those people in Washington doing to protect my interest? Not much. Not the Republicans, not the Democrats. I'm hurting. What are they doing? And people say, hey, I don't want to participate in this process. Doesn't mean anything. I'm not going to vote. Do we really believe that men and women fought and died for us so that billionaires can elect candidates to protect the wealthy and the powerful? And the problems are not just the last 6 years or the last 12 years. The problems are what's been going on over the last 40 years. And the fact of the matter is that today we have working people who are earning, millions of working people, in real inflation accounted for dollars, substantially less than they were 40 years ago. Now, how does it happen, Madam President, when we are seeing an explosion in technology, when worker productivity has gone up, that today the median male worker, that male worker right in the middle of the economy, earned $783 less last year than he made 41 years ago. You look at the people who are angry, that's why they're angry. In inflation accounted for dollars, median male workers making $783 less last year than he made 41 years ago. The median woman worker made $1,300 less last year than she made in 2007. Since 1999, the median middle-class family has seen its income go down by almost $5,000 after adjusting for inflation.
I am the ranking member, the leader of the opposition on the Budget Committee. What the Republican budget does, and no one debates that, but everything I'm telling you is absolutely factual. It ends the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. When you end the Affordable Care Act completely, you are throwing 16 million Americans who now have health insurance, in some cases for the first time in their lives, off of health care. That's it, 16 million. The Republican budget cuts Medicaid by $440 billion. Now, that does a whole lot of things. We've heard some discussion of Medicaid tonight. But what it also does is throw another 11 million people off of health insurance completely. In other words, at a time when 35 million people are already uninsured and many more are underinsured, the Republican budget throws 27 million more people off of health care.
Raising the minimum wage to at least $10.10 an hour, I personally would go higher than that, would not only be good for low-wage workers, it would reduce spending on Medicaid, public housing, food stamps, and other federal programs by some $7 billion a year. Sadly, when I offered an amendment in committee that called for a substantial increase in the minimum wage, not one of my Republican colleagues voted for it. One of the problems that I have had in describing the Republican budget is that it is so bad, is that it is so far out of touch from where the American people are that people really don't even believe you when you talk about what is in this budget. Today, we live in a society where the top 1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Here's the chart. The top 1% owns almost as much wealth. Here's the top 1% going up. Here's the bottom 90% going down. That is the reality. As the Republican budget say, wow, look at that extraordinary disparity in wealth, and we're going to do something about it. Yeah, they do something about it. Their proposals will make the rich even richer and working people even poorer. At a time when senior poverty is increasing, the Republican budget calls for ending Medicare as we know it by turning it into a voucher program. What does that mean? What the Republican idea is that we give people a voucher. I don't know that they have an exact amount for that voucher, maybe $8,000, whatever. And they say, here's a check for $8,000, and you're 85 years of age, and you're struggling with cancer. Here's your check for $8,000, and you go out to a private insurance company, and you get the best deal you can. Well, you tell me, Mr. President, if you're 85 years of age and you're struggling with cancer or heart disease, and somebody gives you a check for $8,000, you tell me what kind of private insurance you're going to be able to get. How many days will it last you in the hospital? This is an effort to undermine and destroy Medicare. It is a disastrous idea. That is exactly what is in the Republican proposal. Mr. President, at a time when millions of disabled people are trying to survive on less than $14,000 a year, the Republican budget would pave the way for a massive cut to Social Security disability insurance. Young people are really wondering whether or not they want to go to college because they're so nervous about the debt that they will have when they come out. What is the Republican response to the crisis of the lack of affordability of college? Here's their response. They would cut Pell Grants by more than $85 billion over the next decade, which would make the cost of college education more expensive for some 8 million Americans. In other words, instead of addressing this crisis Instead of helping make us competitive in a global economy by giving us the best educated workforce, what they do is move us in the wrong direction. In the midst of throwing 27 million Americans off of health insurance, in the midst of cutting $85 billion for Pell Grants to make it harder for our kids to go to college, in the midst of making massive cuts in nutrition programs, which will increase hunger and suffering in the United States of America, Republicans do something else that is literally remarkable, and I know people think I'm not telling the truth. I am. What they say is that when the rich are getting richer, when almost all new income and wealth is going to the people on top, what they have decided to do for the wealthiest 6,000 families in America, the top 0.2%, what they say to these billionaire families, we are going to give you a massive tax break by repealing the estate tax. What we are going to do is give you a $269 billion tax breaks that goes to the top 0.2%. 99.8% of the American people will not gain one nickel in benefit from the repeal of the estate tax. Only goes to the wealthiest of the wealthy. But to add insult to injury, while giving a huge tax break for the billionaire class, what the Republican budget also says is let's see if we can raise taxes on lower income and working class families by allowing the expanded earned income tax credit and child tax credit to expire. These are tax credits that go to working families and lower income families who have kids. One of the reasons that we have a huge debt, not the only reason, but one of the reasons, is that the United States under President Bush went into war in Iraq, went into war in Afghanistan. Now, nobody knows what the end cost of that war will be by the time we take care of the last veteran 50 or 60 years from now. But the best guesses are that those wars will cost us $4 to $6 trillion by the time we take care of the needs of our last veteran who served in those wars. Mr. President, how do we pay for those wars? How do we pay for those wars? Every other war that this country fought, presidents had the courage to go forward and say, wars are expensive, we're going to raise taxes. Not in this case. Those wars were put on the credit card, $4 to $6 trillion, and we didn't pay for it. But apparently my Republican colleagues haven't learned a simple lesson that you can't be honest and worry about the deficit and then go to war and not pay for it. What they have done in this budget is to increase Pentagon spending by another $38 billion next year and $186 billion over the next 10 years. And how is that paid for? Oh, it's not paid for. It goes on to the credit card. They put it all into the so-called OCO account. And this is, by the way, an account that many of my conservative friends have called an accounting gimmick. So here we are. Here we are, Mr. President, at a time when this country probably faces more serious problems than any time since the Great Depression. Middle class is disappearing, poverty much too high, the gap between the very, very, very rich and everybody else growing wider and wider, real unemployment much too high, young people unable to afford to go to college. And on every one of those issues, the Republican budget does exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. In the year 2015, we should not be voting or bringing forth a budget which makes the billionaires even richer while cutting programs for people who are struggling.
Okay, Bernie Sanders wants to give you a free college education, and he's going to make Wall Street pay for it. Boom, I'm down.
Senator Sanders' proposal is exactly what the broken system of the U.S. higher education system needs. A free education means a free society. I want to thank Senator Sanders for being a champion for students and working families. Students and families need tuition-free college, and we need Senator Sanders' legislation to ensure that education is a right, not a privilege.
I still leave school with $26,000 in debt, and I am considered lucky out of other college students because the average college student leaves school with $29,400 in student loan debt.
I can't pay my student loans. Hey, that's him! Tax Wall Street.
Not Main Street.
Tax the 1% who ruined our economy.
Putting on the record exactly what his platform is.
The burden of student loan debt is making it much harder for young people to get mortgages and buy homes. Home ownership rates for young adults are among the lowest in decades. Young people are putting off marriage and having children partly because of the burden of student debt. Right now, working class families all over this country are asking themselves a very simple question, and their kids are asking a question. Does it make sense for them to go $40,000, $50,000, or $100,000 in debt in order to get a college education? And what many of these young people and families are saying is, no, it doesn't make sense. So in a competitive global economy, what we are saying to families all over this country, we do not want your kids to get a college education. We don't want them to become doctors or nurses, business people, scientists, teachers. We don't want them to expand their intellectual capability and make us a competitive nation in this highly competitive global economy. According to a Pew study of 18 to 34-year-olds who haven't completed college, 48% say they cannot afford to do so. What does it say about our country when hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young people who want to contribute, who want to do more with their lives, cannot get the education that they need? It deprives them from, in many cases, making it into the middle class, and it denies this nation the intellectual capabilities that they have. So here's the bottom line. The bottom line that all over this country, students and their families are facing crushing debts, radically impacting their lives and the choices that they make. And there are some in the United States Senate who say, yeah, that's pretty bad. How can we make it even worse? How can we raise interest rates for our kids? Make it harder for them to go to college. Make sure that when they get out of college, they are more deeply in debt. And I say no. I think that's absurd. I would remind you, Mr. President, that when Wall Street banks borrow money, you know what they're getting it for today? Less than 1%, 0.75%. And we are talking now about families having to spend 6%, 7%, 8%, 9% in order to send their kids to college, to help our country, to make it into the middle class. That's absurd. We have got to make sure that every qualified American in this country who wants to go to college, who has the ability and the desire to go to college, is able to go to college regardless of the income of his or her family. How are we going to pay for the estimated $750 billion over the next 10 years that this program will cost? And here's the answer. At a time of massive income and wealth inequality, at a time when trillions of dollars in wealth have been shifted from the middle class and working families of this country to the top 0.1%, at a time when the wealthiest people in this country have made huge amounts of money from risky derivative transactions and the soaring value of the stock market, this legislation would impose a speculation fee on Wall Street investment houses and hedge funds. More than 1,000 economists have endorsed a tax on Wall Street speculation, and today some 40 countries throughout the world have already imposed a financial transaction tax, including Britain, Germany, France, Switzerland, China, and many others. This legislation would impose a Wall Street speculation fee of 0.5% on stock trades, a 0.1% fee on bonds, and an even lower fee on derivatives. What is the United States Congress doing to address what the scientific community says is the greatest crisis facing our planet?
Which is why, in his role as chairman of the Senate's Green Jobs Subcommittee, Senator Bernie Sanders introduced legislation to encourage the installation of 10 million solar power systems on the rooftops of homes and businesses over 10 years. The bill would authorize rebates, which would cover up to half the cost of the systems.
According to a study published in the journal Environmental Research Letters in May of last year, more than 97% of peer-reviewed scientific literature on climate supports the view that human activity is a primary cause of global warming. What disturbs me very much about this debate is the rejection of basic science. We can have differences of opinion on health care, on the funding of education, on whether or not we should have a jobs program, on many other issues. But what the United States Senate should not be about is rejecting basic science, and it saddens me very much that most of my colleagues in the Republican Party are doing just that. We don't hear great debates on the floor of the Senate regarding research in terms of cancer, in terms of heart disease, in terms of other scientific issues. But for whatever reasons, and I happen to believe those reasons have a lot to do with the power of the coal industry, of the oil industry, of the fossil fuel industry, we're suddenly seeing a great debate on an issue that the overwhelming majority of scientists agree on, and that is climate change is real. It is caused by human activity. First, we need to aggressively expand energy efficiency all over this country. In terms of older homes and buildings, we can save an enormous amount of fuel, cut carbon emissions, lower fuel bills, create jobs if we do that. Furthermore, we must move aggressively to such sustainable energies as wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, and other technologies, and we must invest in research and development to make those technologies even more efficient. In my view, it is a no-brainer to say that we must reject the proposed Keystone XL pipeline once and for all. We need to end tax breaks and subsidies for oil and coal companies, which amount to well over $10 billion a year. We should not be subsidizing those companies that are helping to destroy our planet. Finally, we need to price carbon through a carbon tax or some other approach so that the real cost of burning carbon are reflected in the price. And I'm very proud that Senator Barbara Boxer, chairperson of the Environmental Committee, and I introduced such legislation last year. Bottom line is, Mr. President, we are in a pivotal moment in history. This Congress has got to act. It has to act boldly. And when we do that, when we cut greenhouse gas emissions, when we transform our energy system, we can save many people money on their fuel bills. We can cut pollution in general. We can cut greenhouse gas emissions significantly, and we can create good-paying jobs all over this country. As a nation, we may disagree about this approach or that approach, but if we don't get our act together and recognize the severity of this crisis, start that debate, come up with ideas to solve it, the planet that we're going to leave our kids and our grandchildren will be much less habitable and much more dangerous than the planet we have today.
Many of you may recall one of the great speeches given in the modern history of America. And it was given by that noted communist Dwight D. Eisenhower. And just as he was leaving office, when Kennedy was coming in, he said, "Beware the military-industrial complex." And he said, "These people are self-serving." And this is coming from the guy who was a four-star general who led the effort in Europe, who knew a little bit about military stuff. And he said, "Beware them, that they're not necessarily interested in the well-being of our country. They're interested in their own power and their own profits." I think what Eisenhower said 50 plus years ago is true today. These guys are enormously powerful. The truth is, when we speak about discretionary spending, the money is in the Defense Department. That is more than half of our discretionary spending, and I think it's appropriate, and the GAO has taken a hard look at defense spending. Not to say that that is the only agency, but that's where a lot of money is. At a time when the U.S. spends more on the Pentagon than the next 9 countries combined, and when over half of our discretionary spending goes to the Pentagon, we have got to pay close attention to this issue. The situation has become so absurd that the Pentagon is unable to even account for how it spends its money. Now, we can argue about whether you need this weapon system or that weapon system or the size of the Pentagon, but I would hope there is no disagreement that at least we should have an understanding of how the Pentagon spends its money. Time and time again, the GAO has said that it is simply unable to audit the Pentagon. In fact, the GAO has reported that it has been unable to conduct a review of the Pentagon's financial records due to, and I quote, "serious financial management problems at the Department of Defense that made its financial statements unauditable."
I want to see an America where when young black men walk down the street, they will not be harassed by police officers, they will not be killed, they will not be shot. It is not acceptable to me, and I know to you, that an African American baby, a male baby born today, if we do not change things, stands a 1 in 4 chance of being in prison during his life. In America today, we have more people in jail than any other country on earth. That's right. And one of the reasons, aside from a broken criminal justice system, one of the reasons that we have so many people in jail is that we have 5.5 million kids hanging out on street corners with no jobs and no education. And it seems to me to make a lot more sense to invest in education and jobs for our kids rather than in jail and incarceration. I want our country to have the best educated people, more people going to college than any other country, not more people in jail than any other country.
Oh, you said that you've been fighting for civil rights. You were there in the March to Washington. Can you point to any legislation in the past 10 years that you've supported that have benefited the African American community and communities of color in this country?
Sure. Many.
Can you name a couple?
Well, yeah. We built in the Affordable Care Act, which is providing health insurance to many millions of Americans. We got a provision in there, a $12 billion provision, which expanded community health centers all over America, hundreds of new community health centers, most of them, or many of them, in low-income and minority communities. That means that millions of people who otherwise would not have been able to access health care are now getting health care, dental care, mental health counseling, and low-cost prescription drugs. That's pretty good.
The truth is that for many, many decades, there have been situations where police officers have treated prisoners terribly, and in some cases absolutely unjustly kill them. All right, what do we have to do? We have to do a number of things. If a police officer does something wrong, and I think we saw that tape in South Carolina, right? And that police officer was indicted. Police officers, like anybody else, have got to be held accountable for their actions. Yes. If they break the law, they have got to be held accountable. The second issue, I am very concerned when you see the TV in Ferguson and elsewhere, where these police departments look like they are part of an army, an invading army.
That over the last year, from April 2014 to March of 2015, the average real unemployment rate for black high school graduates was 51.3%. This is an issue that cannot be ignored. An entire generation of young people who are trying to get their lives together, trying to earn some money, trying to become independent, are unable to find work. And this is an issue that must be dealt with. Even young Americans with a college degree are finding it increasingly difficult to get a job. The real unemployment rate for young black college graduates between the ages of 21 and 24 was 23%. The figure for Hispanics was 22.4%, and the figure for whites was 12.9%. Last week, I introduced legislation with Congressman John Conyers and Senator Debbie Stabenow to provide $5.5 billion to immediately begin funding states and localities throughout this country to employ 1 million young people between the ages of 16 and 24 and provide job training to hundreds of thousands of young Americans. I have introduced legislation that would put $1 trillion into our roads and bridges, which would create up to 13 million jobs.
What a political revolution means is that ordinary people, working people, low-income people, understand the significance of politics and government for their lives.
It is a great honor to introduce a man who dedicates his every waking hour to standing up for working people and the middle class. Ladies and gentlemen, the next President of the United States of America, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders!
Thank you. You know, we have had large turnouts in Wisconsin, in Colorado. This is the largest turnout. Thank you. Are we content to seeing a proliferation of millionaires and billionaires when we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth? It is a moral issue, but it is an economic issue as well, because our economy cannot do well when so few have so much and so many have so little. Now, when we talk about the crises facing our country, when pollsters ask people, what's on your mind? What do you think is most important? What people invariably say is jobs. We need more jobs. Well, in my view, when we have over 30% youth unemployment, 10.5% unemployment in general, when our infrastructure, our roads, bridges, water systems, rail are crumbling, we can and should put millions of people back to work rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure. I have introduced legislation that would put $1 trillion into our roads and bridges, which would create up to 13 million jobs. And that is exactly what we have to do. It is not acceptable to me, and I know to you, that an African American baby, a male baby born today, if we do not change things, stands a 1 in 4 chance of being in prison during his life. In America today, we have more people in jail than any other country on earth. That's right. And one of the reasons, aside from a broken criminal justice system, one of the reasons that we have so many people in jail is that we have 5.5 million kids hanging out on street corners with no jobs and no education. And it seems to me to make a lot more sense to invest in education and jobs for our kids rather than in jail and incarceration. I want our country to have the best educated people, more people going to college than any other country, not more people in jail than any other country. Jeb Bush thinks the American people need to work a little bit harder. Well, he obviously didn't hear the sad reality that the American people already work the longest hours of any major country on earth. Our people do not need to work longer hours, they need higher wages and better income. We have got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, $15 an hour. All over this country, we have working people who, when they get sick, they go to work. And they go to work because they have no guaranteed sick time. It's time to end that and provide guaranteed paid sick time for every worker in America. I have introduced legislation and will fight for as president to make every public college and university in America tuition free. Today, the United States of America is the only major country on earth that does not guarantee health care to all people as a right. And together, you and I are going to end that embarrassment because we are going to pass a Medicare for all single-payer program. In my view, if a financial institution is too big to fail, it is too big to exist. And that is why I have introduced legislation to break these huge financial institutions up. We must lead the world in an extremely aggressive way in breaking our dependence on fossil fuels, in moving to wind, solar, geothermal, and other sustainable energies. We have got to understand that today in America, there are 11 million people living in the shadows. People who are afraid that they could be deported tomorrow. That is wrong. We need comprehensive immigration reform. We need a path towards citizenship for undocumented people. We need not to be dividing families. We need to be uniting families and keeping them together. That as a result of the disastrous Supreme Court decision in the Citizens United case, the American political system has been totally corrupted, and the foundations of American democracy are being undermined. When one family spends more money than either of the two major political parties, that is not democracy, that is oligarchy. And that is why we have got to overturn Citizens United. And why we need public funding of elections. I see a lot of young people here today. And I want our young people to be able to run for office if they want to and not have to beg money from the rich and the powerful to do that. Ask your Republican friends why they vote for folks who want tax breaks for billionaires and yet they want to cut Social Security and Medicare. Ask them why they're voting for people who are going to throw them out onto the street, shut down their factories, and move their plants abroad. So what we need to do is to create a political movement which brings our people together.
Give Bernie Sanders your vote. Bernie Sanders your vote. Give Bernie Sanders your vote.
Give him your vote.
Healthcare, education, clean energy are gonna keep this country afloat.
You know
he works for the people and not the billionaires. Gonna make them pay for what they broke.
You gotta get ready for election day.
Give Bernie Sanders your vote.
Ready for election day.
Give Bernie Sanders your vote.
Bernie in 2000